Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for an auspicious event in the life of Penn Law and the University of Pennsylvania. We believe here at Penn Law School that law is deeply connected with other spheres of study elsewhere in the university, and we also believe in connecting with the very top scholars and policymakers and thinkers from around the world. And this event embodies both of those principles. We have in Elyn Saks, one of the leading thinkers on law and mental health. And we're so glad to have you, Professor Saks, speaking on The Center Cannot Hold, My Life as a Patient and a Legal Professional. This event is the capstone of an issue. We've been a series of events on mental health, and we've been working with our students and community throughout the year. Our theme with our students for the Center on Professionalism has been Mind Your Mind, Applied Positive Psychology and the Law School Experience. This year of programming has provided our students with tools to think about their own lives as they enter a profession which has high rates of substance abuse and mental health issues. And this is a tremendous continuation of that discussion about the importance of focusing on mental health issues in our society and in our respective professions. I'm also so glad to see so many colleagues from around the University of Pennsylvania coming to the law school. This is an issue, of course, that cuts across so many disciplines like bioethics and medicine and nursing and other parts of the university represented here. So it's great to see you in attendance. I want to thank Dr. Saul Feldman for his important work in the public and private sector on mental health care, especially his commitment to creating community-based centers that provide behavioral health care and developing specialized training programs for care providers. I want to thank the Bay Area Foundation for Human Resources for supporting this event and providing us with the resources for this and many other efforts and events relating to behavioral health law and policy. And finally, this is a joint effort and co-sponsors from both here at the law school and around the university who are helping include Penn Law's Center on Professionalism, our Fund for the Study of Behavioral Health Law and Policy, the Perelman School of Medicine's Scattergood Program for Applied Ethics and Behavioral Health Care. So I look forward to the lecture, and I will turn over with appreciation to the organizer of this, who had the vision to bring Professor Saks, my colleague, Professor Eric Feldman.
Thank you, Dean Ruger. Thanks to all of you. This is really quite an extraordinary turnout. Don't tell him, but this is a better turnout than we had for Jeb Bush a couple of weeks ago. So it's really quite gratifying to see. Before I introduce Professor Saks, just a few thank yous. The Dean mentioned the 3 sponsoring organizations, but behind those organizations there have been a couple of people who have really been tremendously helpful. So the vision is not at all mine. I've just really helped to facilitate it. So Dom Sisti, who runs the Scattergood program, Jen Leonard, who runs our Center of Professionalism, a third-year law student here, Anna Marion, a postdoc working with Steve Jaffe over in the bioethics program, Isabel Pereira. The 4 of us sat and really thought about what sort of event would connect the work we do in the law school with the work of the Center on Professionalism, Dom's work in the medical school, and cut across the university's focus on behavioral health and mind and mindfulness. And Professor Saks struck us as the absolutely ideal speaker to bring in. In addition, I really want to thank my friend and colleague on the faculty of the law school, Stephen Morse, sitting right behind Professor Saks. Stephen spent well over a decade on the USC faculty. He held the Orrin Evans Chair at the law school, the chair that Professor Saks now holds. He's continued his extraordinary work on mental health law and policy at Penn, and like Professor Saks, is appointed both in the law school and the medical school. And so really thank you, Stephen, not only for introducing me to Professor Saks, without which maybe you would have said no and not come to Penn. So I'll never know that, but I'm really grateful for that. And after Professor Saks's talk today, Professor Morse will take the stage and engage Professor Saks in a 10 or 15-minute interactive conversation before we open the floor to questions and answers. So thank you so much for that, Stephen. I'm honored and frankly quite humbled to be introducing Professor Saks to you today. If one looks at her academic accomplishments, they are daunting, awe-inspiring, and rather intimidating. She graduated as an undergraduate first in her class at Vanderbilt University, was awarded a Marshall Scholarship to study at Oxford, received her JD at Yale, where she worked as an editor of the Law Review, later went back and on the side got a PhD in psychoanalysis. She holds a chair at USC Law School and is appointed in the medical school. She has an honorary doctorate from Pepperdine University. She's written 5 important books and endless influential articles. It's a vita that I can think of few, if any, law professors at any law school in the world that can equal that. And you know, just to not leave it out, I should mention that she's also the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award. And there I think one should underscore the word perhaps genius. So it's really quite an extraordinary academic background. But her life, as we know, and I think as the title suggests, has not only been about academic accomplishment. In her gripping book, which I've read now twice and most recently finished all of 2 days ago, Professor Saks recounts her long struggle with mental illness, her debilitating psychotic episodes, her losing battle to avoid psychotropic medications, and her eventual diagnosis of schizophrenia. These remarkable academic achievements and these remarkable challenges add up to a life that I think can only be described as extraordinary. But what I find most compelling about her work and about Elyn is that despite the extraordinariness, and I think that's really a word that's appropriate here, her story is profoundly and utterly human. Like all of us, she has spent her life seeking personal and professional satisfaction. She takes pride in her intellectual accomplishments, relishes her friendships, loves her family, finds meaning in her work, delights in a good joke, adores her partner. As she writes on the very last page of The Center Cannot Hold, and I quote, "The humanity we all share is more important than the mental illness we may not." When I read that and read her book, I was reminded of something written 2,000 years ago, Plato's Apology, where Socrates utters the famous phrase, "The unexamined life is not worth living." In her tireless effort to understand herself, Professor Saks has done more examining than Socrates could have ever thought possible. In doing so, she has inspired countless others to reflect, to introspect, and to find meaning in who they are and in what they do. She has, in these profound ways, helped us to understand what it means to be human. So thank you, Elyn, for spending your afternoon with us today, talking both about your journey and about your work. Thanks to all of you for being here to share it with us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Saks.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So thanks for the kind introduction to the program by Dean Ted Ruger. I really appreciate it. And the introduction by Eric, which I think may be the nicest introduction I ever got, so thank you. So I want to thank Eric for inviting me here. I'm also delighted that Eric's family could come, his psychologist father, who's done important work in the mental health and mental health law space, and his mom and his brother and sister-in-law and wife and daughter. So 75% of the audience is Eric's family. And I also want to shout out a hello to friends on your faculty, including Stephen Morse, who left as I came in, and we share the same name of our chairs, as was said. And I'd like to thank Sally Gordon, who was a classmate of mine at Yale Law School, Howard Chang and Michael Knoll, who were faculty members with me at USC, and we're so sorry that they left, but I'm sure you're happy they're here. So I'm going to talk today about my life with mental illness, both my struggles and my managing to craft a good life for myself in the face of a grave prognosis. At the end of the talk, I'll discuss some policy implications of my story, recognizing that I'm an N of only one. And I will discuss a cluster of mental health law issues. And I'm delighted again that we have psychologist Dr. Saul Feldman here, and we'll look at some of his major issues as well. So I want to speak today to you about a subject that I would like to see get more attention in our research, the relational aspects of schizophrenia. Good psychiatric treatment has kept me alive. Sensitive and wise psychiatric treatment that has recognized the centrality of relationships to my healing has allowed me to flourish. As mental health professionals, mental health students, mental health law students, professors, you know that people who struggle with mental health disorders are not just walking symptoms that can be cured by a pill. Mental health and mental illness involve whole people who live in relational, political, and social contexts. We need to understand people in the richness and fullness of their lives. I have titled my talk today, Schizophrenia and I, Making Peace with Mental Illness. My title is an attempt to convey that schizophrenia is a relational illness. By relational, I mean that it involves personal identity, that it profoundly implicates one's social world, and that it has political meanings as well. So that's what I want to address today, the identity, the social, and the political aspects of schizophrenia. And I'll be discussing these three aspects by using excerpts from my memoir, The Center Cannot Hold My Journey Through Madness, as a window into these issues. I've left time at the end for discussion, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts and questions about my reflections. I first became seriously ill as a Marshall Scholar studying ancient philosophy at Oxford. At first, it seemed like I had depression with mild paranoid features, which is actually often how schizophrenia begins. But then my illness evolved into a pure thought disorder rather than a mood disorder. Despite much resistance, I eventually found my way to a psychiatric hospital with strong encouragement from my doctors at the university, whom I'd seen at the urging of a doctor friend. I had graduated as class Victorian at Vanderbilt and been accepted as a Marshall Scholar at Oxford. But I was in terrible shape. I spent much of my time wandering the streets of Oxford, mumbling to myself and contemplating various ways to commit suicide to rid the world of my evil. I had absolutely no insight into the severity of my condition. I had no awareness that there might be a gap between how I saw myself and how others saw me. I entered the hospital voluntarily. After a week or two of being there, everything changed. It wasn't something a doctor or a fellow patient or a nurse said. It was a simple look into a mirror. I saw myself, reading from my book. It was the first time I'd actually seen myself in weeks, and it felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. Good God, I thought, who is that? I was emaciated and hunched over like someone 3 or even 4 times my age. My face was gaunt, my eyes were simultaneously vacant and full of terror. My hair was wild and filthy, my clothes wrinkled and stained. It was a visage of a crazy person on the long-forgotten back ward of a hospital for lunatics, ending the passage. The gap between who I imagined myself to be and whom I saw in the mirror that day was profound and unavoidable. Far from making peace with my mental illness, until that moment, I did not truly understand that I had a mental illness to make peace with. That moment, that look in the mirror, was the beginning of a journey that would last a quarter of a century. In retrospect, it was no accident that the song I chose to listen to most on the psych ward after that experience was the Beatles. Once there was a way to get back homeward, once there was a way to get back home. I needed to find my way home. Finding my way home and finding my way back to a relational life. Now, I think Freud was a brilliant thinker and he got many things right. What I don't think Freud got right is his view that intense talk therapy is inappropriate for people who are psychotic. According to Freud, analysis wasn't appropriate because an individual who was actively psychotic could not form transfer into the analyst. Freud's view is absolutely not consistent with my experience. In my experience, the need to be in a relationship, to be part of a social world, and may be most profound precisely when someone is psychotic. Finding my way home and finding my way back to a relational life. I began my first work as a psychoanalyst at Oxford, and it was difficult, painful work. What I noticed from my first experience with intensive talk therapy is two things. First, my analyst was hugely helpful in diffusing a sense of shame that went along with the thoughts I was having. My thoughts were violent and deeply disturbing about myself and other people. My analyst, Mrs. Jones, was able to tolerate everything. It's difficult for me adequately to convey how helpful it was to me to have someone listen, not judge me, and not threaten to put me in the hospital or call the police, as might have happened in the US. Shame is a powerful component in a psychotic illness. We understand the shame that comes from a person in the aging process who soils her or himself. We see it, we smell it, we feel the shame. Often for individuals with a psychotic illness, the shame is every bit as real and every bit as intense, but it's invisible to others. Second, I noticed that as I felt more related to my analyst, Mrs. Jones, I began to make friends again and be able to work again. Now I realized that someone could object by questioning the direction of the causal arrows here. Fair enough. My point is that as I became able to share my internal experience, as I could relate to someone without shame, my ability to interact with the world around me became much better. I want to note and emphasize that the most helpful thing that I had, a consultant that I had in England said two things. First, I needed to be in intensive psychotherapy 5 days a week. And second, I should be back in school as a way to exercise my mind. A lot of people were saying, withdraw from school, go back to the States. I think the consultant was right, and I will be forever grateful to him. I finished my degree at Oxford, and I came back to the States to study law at Yale. My transition was rocky. For someone not familiar with a psychotic illness, it's difficult to understand that at this point, I did not really believe I had a mental illness. My thought was that I was somehow different from other people, and not in a good way, but that through the exercise of willpower, I could tame whatever was wrong. Quite literally, like one has a wild horse in a corral that you must tame. The challenge, as I framed it at that point in my life, was to take that woman I'd seen in the mirror and tame her and groom her. Or maybe just make sure she always stayed at home when I went out. So I began Yale Law School. I was not in treatment, nor was I on medication. Parenthetically, my analyst in Oxford, Mrs. Jones, never suggested that I consider medication, even though I was psychotic most of the time. Within several weeks after law school began, I became overwhelmed. One night in the library of the Yale Law School, I went out on the roof and became quite psychotic. I was taken to the hospital by one of my professors the next day, whose assignment had sent me over the edge. At the hospital, I found myself in a small private room waiting for a doctor. The attendant was kind, and I readily gave him the telephone wire belt, which I proudly made the evening before, when I'd been floridly psychotic on the roof of the Yale Law School and not satisfied with my jeans and t-shirt, wanted to accessorize. I had also picked up a 6-inch nail that I kept in my pocket, which resulted in my first experience of being mechanically restrained. Many people who are psychotic carry things which can be used as weapons, not because they want to hurt someone, but because they're afraid that someone might want to hurt them. Shame and fear are cues to the relational aspects of the illness. Shame is a pervasive experience of people with psychosis. Often, we are ashamed of what we're thinking, and so we hide our thoughts from other people. This shame may play itself out in many ways. After my experience of being restrained in the emergency room, 5 months of hospitalization ensued. Hospitalization involving long-term restraints and seclusion, forcible medication, and little privacy. In the beginning, I was even watched as I took a shower and went to the bathroom, and was not allowed privacy when talking with other people, even with my parents. I believe the hands-off approach, perhaps it could even be called benign neglect in the Oxford Hospital, was much preferable to the over-interventionist approach, often driven by risk management concerns of the American hospitals. As I've come to say, I am very pro-psychiatry, but I'm very anti-force. Generally, in my experience, people do not like it when force is exerted in their relationships, and my experience is exactly the same in treatment relationships. After 2 weeks on an emergency commitment, I was faced with the question of whether I would try to get out of the hospital. The doctors, it's kind of funny, put me on an emergency commitment because they said I was dangerous to myself and others, and they also said I was gravely disabled. And the reason they gave for saying that I was gravely disabled was I couldn't do my Yale Law School homework, which made me wonder about much of the rest of New Haven. I could contest their motion to civilly commit me. To me, the choice seemed clear. I would demand a hearing to fight the commitment. I brought this up to my father, who's also an attorney, and my father was equally clear. Do not contest this, because if you lose, you now have been civilly committed, and you're going to have to report your commitment every time you apply for a license to practice law. He said to me, you certainly don't want anything in your record where a judge orders you to stay in the hospital. I'll be forever grateful to my father that I do not have the burden of a civil commitment in my background that, to this day, I might be forced to disclose. When I speak about the political dimensions of schizophrenia, I speak not only about the social stigma, which is real and pervasive. I also speak about these life events that can follow an individual with schizophrenia for decades. There are profound political aspects to this illness that can become huge burdens that people with schizophrenia carry, and it's important that you, who may connect with people with schizophrenia, are aware of them and are aware that they can affect a person's life choices. So we've discussed the personal identity aspects of the illness, talked some about the social aspects, and I've touched upon the political aspects. I want to push these ideas further by talking more about the centrality of relationships to healing. Healing does not occur in isolation. It's painful to me when I speak to mental health professionals working in community mental health centers who measure their caseloads in the hundreds. I have a good friend who's a psychiatrist at kind of the premier community mental health center in Los Angeles. She has 350 patients. How on earth do you treat 350 patients? Healing begins in relationship, and in all kinds of ways, a patient's relationship with a mental health professional is an integral part of the healing. I worry tremendously that this point has been lost on our policymakers. Of course, other relationships are healing as well. After I was hospitalized upon returning to the States, I took the rest of that year off, what would have been my first year of law school. To return, Yale had a policy that if you were withdrawn for psychiatric reasons, you needed to be evaluated by the head of student health psychiatry to see if you were ready to return. Like any good student, I looked this guy up. There was no web or anything like that, so I'm looking at periodical indices and article chapters and so on, and I found an article by this guy. Students withdrawn from school for psychiatric reasons, evaluating them for readmission. Questions you want to ask and answers you want to hear. I swear. So I was totally well prepared when I went into the interview, and it unfolded exactly as he had laid it out. And I was readmitted, thankfully. Okay. After I was so I returned to Yale Law School the following fall, and during the second try, I made my closest friend a man named Steve Benke. He's an attorney and a clinical psychologist with an appointment in clinical ethics at Harvard's Department of Psychiatry. We speak on the phone pretty much every day. We're very good friends, quoting from the text. One of the worst aspects of schizophrenia is the profound isolation, the constant awareness that you're different, some sort of alien, not really human. Other people have flesh and bones and insides made of organs and healthy living tissue. You're only a machine with insides made of metal. Medication and talk therapy allay this terrible feeling, but friendship can be as powerful as either. Steve and I were in contracts class together, and a couple of times he asked me for an assignment. Other than that, we'd never really spoken. One evening, though, we sat down at the same table in the law school dining room. The dinner conversation that night was casual and pleasant, drifting from one subject to another: classes, law journals, summer jobs. I noticed that Steve seemed engaged enough. He nodded, he smiled. But after a while, it began to look like simple politeness. As our classmates got up to leave the table, I realized that I wasn't ready to go just yet. And there began one of those conversations that last for a lifetime, one in which there's immediate comfort and acceptance, the equivalence of someone's strong hand offered to you when you most need to grasp it. That first talk flew far and wide: how we got to Yale, who our families were, then philosophy and religion, what mattered to us, and why. Steve had graduated from Princeton as second in his class and then moved to Rome, where he lived with a group of Benedictine monks and read Latin at the Vatican. He considered entering the monastery and studying medieval philosophy, but decided against it because it had ceased to hold his interest, at least as a long-time commitment. So instead of becoming a monk, Steve came to Yale Law School, and so did I, and neither of us was really quite sure why. Sometime later, it occurred to me that at the very moment I was being tied to a bed in a psychiatric ward, screaming bloody murder and afraid for my life, Steve was singing Gregorian chant in a monastery overlooking the ancient city of Rome. And here we were now, come to the same place from two very different directions. It was past midnight when we said goodnight, and as I walked back to my room, I had the distinct feeling, in the middle of my usual muddle, that I'd been unexpectedly blessed. I don't know why I decided to tell Steve the truth about myself. I don't know why I thought I could trust him. But I did. I believed from our very first conversation that this man would be a significant friend and a force for good in my life. Once the possibility came to mind, I realized how much I wanted it to happen. But I didn't believe it could happen unless I revealed the truth about myself and let him see me in full. So much of what I did on a daily basis was about faking it. I knew I would never fake it with him. And so, on a rainy afternoon at a pizzeria in New Haven, I shared my history. Aside from doctors and therapists, it was the first time I'd ever done this with anyone, anywhere, ending the passage. Without Steve's support, I couldn't have made it so successfully through law school if I could have made it at all. He was a second set of eyes who could see me slipping when I couldn't. He was a rock who could support me when I was about to fall. And he was a true friend who helped me find meaning and pleasure in my life when meaning and pleasure felt like different memories. After Steve graduated from law school and left New Haven, my then analyst, Dr. White, announced that he was going to close his practice in 3 months, 2 years earlier than I had planned on leaving. The news of Dr. White's leaving shattered me. I return again to what I see as Freud's mistake that psychotic people don't form transferences with their analysts. In fact, my transferences were quite powerful, and the end of my first 2 analytic relationships could have easily landed me in the hospital. Fortunately, neither did. When White gave me the news of his planned early retirement, Steve was traveling around the country interviewing for PhD programs in clinical psych. He sensed that something was terribly wrong and came to New Haven to see me, reading from the text. I opened the door of my studio apartment. Steve would later tell me that for all the times he'd seen me psychotic, what he saw that day shocked him. For a week or more, I had barely eaten. I was gaunt and moved as though my legs were wooden. My face looked and felt like a mask. Since I pulled down all the shades, the apartment in the middle of the afternoon was in near total darkness. The air was fetid, the place was a shambles. Steve has worked with many patients who suffer from severe mental illness. To this day, he will say that I looked as bad as anybody he had ever seen. Thank you for coming, Steve, I finally said. Crumbling world, word, voice, tell the clocks to stop. Time has come, is to come in. White is leaving, Steve said somberly. I'm being pushed in a grave. The situation is grave, I moaned. Gravity is pulling me down. Tell them to get away. I'm scared. So that's an example of loose associations where words kind of sound alike or loosely related, but put together don't make sense. Healing takes place in many forms and in many venues. I could not have survived this illness without close friends, family, and colleagues who've known me, of course, of my illness and been there to help me. Healing takes place in relationship. As wonderful as Steve was and is, he was a friend, like a brother. Around the time I had received tenure, or shortly after, I ran into a man named Will, a man I thought was cute, friendly, and smart, a man with whom I tried to flirt in the library on weekends, where he was the library on staff, and I was working toward tenure. And one day I saw him in the hall, and I mustered my courage and said, let's have lunch sometime. So we went to lunch. It had actually been over 18 years since I had had a relationship because I was just too tormented to be able to do that. So quoting from the text, when it came to my personal life after my illness had quieted down somewhat, I started nurturing a fragile but growing hope for a relationship with a man named Will, a USC librarian and an artist. Again, I tried flirting with him to no avail. Who knew how to do that? But after he left USC, he invited me to lunch. And then he invited me to see the California Poppy Reserve in Lancaster, not far from Los Angeles, like about an hour away. I kept saying how cold I was, hinting he should put his arm around me, and he never did. So I was really deflated, but when he brought me home, he got out of the car and he kissed me a long, lingering kiss goodnight. And the thought I had, and this is literally the thought that went through my mind, was, this is even better than getting an article accepted. Very, very sad, very sad. The next day, Bill brought me a feather from his parrot, whom he had lovingly described at the restaurant. And I asked my friend, Vanderbilt friend Kenny that night, I don't know why I put it this way, but I said, Kenny, do you think a guy plucking a feather from his bird to paste on your computer means he likes you? To which Kenny responded without a beat, I don't know, Elyn, but one thing for sure, he likes you better than he likes his bird. Which actually, at that moment, was not true. He definitely liked his bird better. Back to the text. I wanted a relationship with Will, and slowly I began to believe it actually might happen. Eventually, I told Will that I loved him, and indeed, he was the first man I had ever really loved in that way, and he said that made him very sad. At the right moment, I told him about my illness, and he responded as gently and kindly as a person could. If Steve's friendship had made me feel human, Will was making me feel like a woman. Ending the passage. When I say my relationship with Steve made me feel human, don't take that metaphorically. I did not feel like a human. I felt my insides were made of metal, and the things that happen to other people, the feelings people have, weren't part of my life. I believed I was something else. It was these two relationships, with Steve and with Will, that brought me not simply to think, but to feel that I am human and capable of loving relationships. No pill could have healed the relational part of myself. I needed other people for that. How am I time? Okay. I'm okay? Okay. Good. Today, Steve and Will are my closest friends, and I think of them as my two pillars. But there was a point where I thought I lost Steve. I suffered from an episode of what's called Capgras Syndrome, in which you believe a person has been taken over by someone or something else. They may look the same, but the person is no longer really that person. This episode happened to me in the mid-90s when I was in a struggle with my analyst, Dr. Kaplan, about how much medication I should be on. We reached a compromise which I wasn't entirely happy with, but with which I had agreed. I was scheduled to give 2 talks, the first on Sunday and the second on Wednesday, at a conference in San Francisco. Once I traveled to San Francisco and checked into my motel, I started falling apart. Kaplan suggested that I give my first talk and then return to LA between talks, which was about 4 or 5 days, which would have made a lot of sense. It would have been a lot cheaper and a lot more comfortable. But for me, having to go home between the talks would represent a failure. If I had to choose between being sick and being a failure, my choice was clear. I would be sick. Reading from the text. My sickness took a new horrific turn. For some reason, I decided that both Kaplan and Steve were imposters. They looked the same, they sounded the same, they were identical in every way to the originals, but they had been replaced by someone or something. Was it the work of alien beings? I had no way of knowing, but I was terrified. It was a struggle, but I delivered my Wednesday paper and fled back to Los Angeles, shaking and completely paranoid. In nearly 10 years of treatment, I had never missed an appointment with Dr. Kaplan. Now, I didn't go to my next 2 scheduled sessions, and didn't call him to say why. He called me, Elyn, we're not at your appointment. What's going on? I did not respond. It's not him. Don't say a word. It's not him. Elyn, what's happening? Nothing. I think it's important that you come to your sessions, he said. I expect you to be here tomorrow. Is there something I can do? I know what's going on and who you are and are not, I said finally. That doesn't get us anywhere, he said. Talk to me straight. Nothing. No answer. Because you are not you. Okay then, I'll see you tomorrow, and he hung up. I did not attend our next session. Steve, sensing that something was very wrong, was calling frequently. I did not return any of his calls. Will, of course, recognized that I was very agitated, but he didn't know why. What's going on, he asked. The 2 who call themselves Kaplan and Steve are imposters, I said. The real ones are gone, and they've been replaced. The ones who are leaving messages on the answering machine are fake. To his everlasting credit, Will stayed calm. Ending the passage. Eventually, I ceded to Kaplan's encouragement to go on more medication, and the delusion passed. This was Will's first experience of me as delusional, and he passed with flying colors. He didn't get too scared, he didn't get angry, he didn't flee, and he treated me with kindness and care. The only way to understand why the Capgras episode was so disturbing to me is to understand that if these relationships were a tether to my own humanness, if I lost these ties to my humanness, I might literally no longer be human. Please understand again, I'm not talking in metaphor here. When you hear patients talk in this way, don't assume they're speaking in metaphor. They might mean quite literally, but with a loss of relationship, they no longer feel human. I've been talking about myself and relationship. I would like to return to say a few more words about my relationship with my mental illness and how I conceptualize that relationship. When I moved to Los Angeles from New Haven, my analyst and I developed a way of talking, a sort of heuristic about my illness and my relationship to my illness. There were, in our way of speaking, three me's: Elyn, Professor Saks, and the lady with the medical charts. I could not integrate these three aspects of myself. How could I be a thinker of big thoughts, an academic, if my mind were so damaged? How could I be both Professor Saks and the lady of the medical charts? And where did Elyn fit in on all of this? What took a huge amount of effort and what was ultimately self-defeating was to keep these three selves separate. I wasn't sure, I want to add as well, this is not anything like multiple personality, these are just aspects of my being. I wasn't sure who was the real me. This confusion expressed itself in an intense ambivalence toward taking my medication. For many years, my motto was, quote, the less medicine, the less effective. Steve was a virtual saint as I spent literally years of our relationship going through time and time when I tried to get off my medication with disastrous results. It wasn't simply that I didn't like the side effects of my psychiatric medication. The need to take medication reached to the core of my identity. If I could get by without medication, I wasn't really mentally ill and the lady of the charts would disappear. Only Elyn and the professor would be left as the real me. This cycle culminated in one final effort to get off my medication several years after I'd been on the faculty at USC. This passage involved two of my close faculty members, a guy named Ed and a guy named Michael. Reading from the text. While White had supported me in my many efforts to get off medication, which I undertook with great gusto and failed miserably at each time, one battle between Kaplan and me concerned the use of meds. Early on, we really locked horns on this. Kaplan thought I should just stay on the meds and get on with my life. As I said, for me, the motto was the less medicine, the less effective, and that held sway. Part of the way that I could prove that I wasn't really mentally ill, which I resisted mightily for many years, was to get off medication. And so I kept trying and trying and trying. I decided to make one last effort to get off. I thought I never really tried hard enough. And I put a lot of extra supports in place to keep me true to my goals. I started the reduction. I hid what I was feeling when I started feeling bad. The days and nights were harder now. The sheer physical efforts of containing my body and my thoughts felt like trying to hold back a team of wild horses. Sleep was spotty and filled with dreams that left me awake and sweating in terror. Nevertheless, I dropped down again. Months before, I'd accepted an invitation to attend a workshop at Oxford and present a paper. By the time I boarded the plane home, I was a complete wreck. When I walked into Kaplan's office my first day back, I headed straight for the corner, crouched down on the floor, and began to shake. All around me were thoughts of evil beings poised with daggers. They'd slice me up in thin slices or make me swallow hot coals. Kaplan would later describe me as, quote, writhing in agony. Even in this state, what he accurately described as acutely and floridly psychotic, I refused to take more meds. The mission is not yet complete. Immediately after the appointment with Kaplan, I went to see Dr. Martyr, a schizophrenia expert who was following me for a movement disorder caused by the medications called tardive dyskinesia. He'd never seen me ill before and had been under the impression, and I hadn't disabused him of it, that I had a mild psychotic illness and my primary concern was minimizing TD. Once in his office, I sat on his couch, folded over, and began muttering. I was disheveled. I couldn't remember when I'd slept or what I'd eaten. When had I bathed? In Oxford? Before Oxford? Did it matter if we were all going to die anyway? Anyone who walked into that room would have thought Martyr was treating a schizophrenic street person, and weeks later, people told me that's exactly what I looked like. Head explosions and people trying to kill. Is it okay if I totally trash your office? I think you need to you need to leave if you think you're going to do that, said Martyr. Okay, Small, fire on ice. Tell them not to kill me. Tell them not to kill me. What have I done wrong? All the explosions, hundreds of thousands with thoughts, interdiction. Elyn, do you feel like you're dangerous to other people or to yourself, he asked. That's a trick question, I said. I don't think you ask a mental health law professor if she meets the statutory criteria for commitment in the language of the statute. I'm not sure what you do, but that doesn't work. No, it's not a trick question, he said. I'm serious. I think you need to be in the hospital. I could get you into UCLA right now, and the whole thing could be very discreet. Ha, ha, ha. You're offering to put me in the hospital? Hospitals are bad. They're mad. They're sad. One must stay away. I'm God, or I used to be. My husband made a marginal note when he was reading this next to I'm God, or I used to be. He said, did you quit or were you fired? And then he asked who would have the authority to fire God, actually. I give life and I take it away. Forgive me for I know not what I do. I really think a hospital would be a good idea, Martyr said. No, thank you oh so very much, I said. All right then, but if I were you, I would stay away from work for a while. You don't want your colleagues to see this. Thanks, bangs, bang, bye, see you soon. Oblivious to the look on his face, I left. The next morning, I dragged myself to my office, which was my hideout and refuge, and I ran into my colleague Ed in the hall, and he quickly figured out what was happening. Elyn, what the hell is going on? I thought you were kidding at first, but you're not, are you? Does anyone else know about this? Is it okay for anyone else to know? I wouldn't mind telling Michael, I said, not the archangel one, the other one. Suffice to say that Ed eventually brought me to the hospital, showing the good judgment to follow my doctor's advice rather than tackle me to the ground and take me to the ER, as others, including Ed's internist wife, were recommending. And eventually, I acceded to everybody's demands to take more medication. I could no longer deny the truth, and I could not change it. The wall that kept me, Elyn, Professor Saks, separate from the insane woman I'd seen in that mirror long ago, lay smashed and in ruins. And then another event pushed me past the point of no return in accepting that I indeed had a mental illness. I got a new drug, quoting from the text. Because of the risks of my meds, Kaplan suggested one of the new classes of antipsychotics, a drug called Zyprexa. In the end, I was on like 5 times the normal dose and still having a lot of breakthrough symptoms, so he changed me to something called clozapine, which is actually the Cadillac in terms of efficacy for psychosis, but very cumbersome. You have to have weekly blood tests for 6 months, and then every other week, and then once a month, but it works really well. But anyway, originally with the olanzapine, or the Zyprexa, the change was fast and dramatic. First, the side effects were much less than they were with Navin. More important, the clinical result was, not to overstate it, like daylight dawning after a long night. I could see the world in a way I'd never seen it before. The illness was still there, but it wasn't pushing me around as much as it once did. Finally, I could focus on the task at hand, unencumbered by the threat of lurking demons. The most profound effect of the new drug was to convince me, once and for all, that I actually had a real illness. As I said, for 20 years I'd struggled with that acceptance, managing to hold on to the belief that basically there was nothing unusual about my thoughts. Everyone's mind contained the chaos that mine did. They were just better off at managing it than I. My problem, I thought, had less to do with my mind than it had to do with my lack of social graces. I wasn't mentally ill. I was socially maladroit. Of course, that wasn't true, and there's no way to overstate what a thunderclap this revelation was to me. And with it, my final and most profound resistance to the idea that I was mentally ill began to give way. Ironically, the more I accepted I had a mental illness, the less the illness defined me. It became accident and not essence, at which point the riptide that had kept sucking me in set me free. I was finally able to integrate the 3 parts of myself. I was indeed Elyn, the professor, and the lady of the charts. All 3 were me, and I was all 3. It was making peace with the lady of the charts, my mental illness, that allowed Elyn and the professor to flourish and enjoy the many wonderful relationships that have blessed my life. So I've been enormously gratified that my memoir, The Center Cannot Hold, has been well received. With monies from a MacArthur grant. Actually, I have a funny story about that. So when I got the MacArthur award, my school gave me a lovely reception, and they gave me a T-shirt with a picture of Einstein and a picture of me, and said, only one of us is a certified genius, to which I said I've been certified many times in the past. Never in that way. So with monies from the court, I founded the Saks Institute for Mental Health, Law, Policy, and Ethics at the law school. We've gone through 6 or 7 years working on topics at this intersection. The goal of the Institute is to translate ideas into action to better the lives of people with mental illness. We are your sisters, your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your colleagues, and your friends. We want, in the words of Sigmund Freud, what everyone wants, to work and to love. With a little help, or perhaps a lot of help from mental health professionals, family members, friends, and colleagues, we can indeed find a life worth living. Thank you very much. So if you want me to talk about the right to refuse, or let's just have a conversation.
That's one more question.
Okay, great. Let's do that then. Okay, thanks.
And there's there someone here who knows how to turn your mics on?
I think I know how.
Okay.
Oh, turn those, oh, yeah, I think I know how.
Is yours on, Stephen?
Is mine on?
Okay, I need help with this as well.
Should be a switch on there.
Switch.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, all right, good.
I don't know how to do it. So that one. And that'll turn green.
Excellent, thank you so much.
There you go. You prefer to sit on the right or the left side?
Right. I mean, so everything's okay.
It's a real honor, and I mean an honor, to be on a panel with Elyn Saks. I've known Elyn for 30 years. She is not only a fabulous scholar, she is a wonderful friend, and she is an inspiration to anybody. When I'm teaching my mental health law class and I want the students to understand what a psychotic break is like from the inside, the first reading in the mental health law class is the first chapter of Elyn's book, The Center Cannot Hold. And I give it to judges when I'm doing judicial training, because unless they have the experience in their families, they don't know either. People just, as Elyn said, people think that people with severe mental illness are talking metaphorically. They're not. It feels an alternative reality. So I start with an anecdote that I tell with Elyn's permission. Some years ago, before The Center Cannot Hold came out, she called me up to talk, as we often talk. She called me up and she said, "Stephen, I have a question for you. What do you think my diagnosis is?" And I said, "Your diagnosis?" She said, "Yeah, my diagnosis." I said, "Well, Elyn, you're odd." And she copped to that immediately. But then she said, "No, really, what's my diagnosis of major mental disorder?" And I said, "Frankly, I have no idea." And that led to a conversation. She was thinking of writing the book. The lead mental health professional who was treating her at the time, as she told me, didn't want her to do it. He said, "People are going to just say, 'Oh, you're the crazy law professor.'" And she wanted my opinion. And I knew Elyn to be a person of valor, of courage, of character. And I thought she had a story to tell that the whole world should know. So I encouraged her. So my first question to you, Elyn, is, would you talk a little bit about how you came to make the decision to do this amazing book?
Thank you so much. You know, I thought about it for many years. And I don't remember the moment when I finally committed, I'm going to do this. But I talked it over with my friend Steve. I talked it over with my psychiatrist. I talked it over with you. One of my friends who's a geriatric psychiatrist said, you basically want to become known as a schizophrenic with a job, and that's not how I wanted to be known, but I thought it would just send the wrong message that this is just too awful to say out loud to do it under a pseudonym, and this person now says she was wrong. It was a good thing to do. One thing actually happened around that time, which was Michael Lauder. Do you remember that story? He was a Yale Law School graduate, and he had schizophrenia. I don't think he was ever able to work, but he had a wife, and they lived near Cornell, I think, as I recall. And he stopped taking his medication because he thought he didn't need the meds anymore, and he became floridly psychotic, and he killed his wife and their unborn child. And that, that happens. It's horrible, it's terrible, but it's not the whole story about mental illness. And if people don't tell the story of nonviolence and success and kindness or whatever, people are going to have important misconceptions. So that was another motive. It also made me feel a little bit more scared about doing it, because what people say, got to watch out for her. She may. Yeah. There was one person in the law school, an administrator, who, after my book came out, came and told me she's glad she didn't know I had schizophrenia before we started going out to dinner. And I said, "Why?" And she said, "I never would have gone to dinner with you." And I thought, a kind and smart and well-meaning person had such fantasies about what schizophrenia means that she like wouldn't go to a public restaurant with me. That hurt. But.
One of the issues that Elyn has written about more in terms of policy than in terms of her personal story is the right of people with severe mental illness to be able to refuse treatment and competence to refuse. One of the things we know, as Elyn is very aware, is, and as she said, not only are these drugs not a relation provider, but they are only moderately effective, and for many people, the side effects are very aversive. And people who've had a lot of experience in the mental health system may understand that not much has worked or that the side effects have been very aversive. And by the way, the best study of this shows that that's about as true with the second generation antipsychotics as it is with the first. At first we thought the second generations worked so much better, but now we know it's simply not true. In light of that, Elyn, how does that experience, and you can talk more generally about the right to refuse and competence, how should that affect our thinking about the right to refuse?
You mean how effective or ineffective?
How effective or ineffective?
Well, I think it's a very important question. You're going to force someone to do something that's not going to help them very much. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. I think a right to refuse is extremely important. I just think it's really important. And that the standard of competence to refuse is what the standard should be. And I think like half the jurisdictions in America have that standard. So for me, meds have helped enormously. But other people, they haven't, or they don't like the side effects or whatever. I mean, I like to say, if the choice is between slobbering at night and being psychotic, I'm going to slobber at night. If the choice is between gaining some weight or being psychotic, I'm going to gain weight. If I gained 100 pounds, I might feel differently. And people have different, risk-benefit calculuses about in their own life. And what I like to say is it's sort of, an important decision for everybody, her or himself, to make, what matters to them and why and what they can do. I do think if you lack capacity to decide, then a benign other should step in. So if someone were to say, doctor or my lawyer, this medication has helped me enormously in the past. I really wish I could take it, but a voice tells me that if I take it, it's going to cause a nuclear holocaust. I don't think that person has the capacity to refuse meds, and I think we should, require them to take meds. But I do think, what's really one of the really important things is, the efficacy of the drugs and the side effect, profile. And I think more people are going to be willing to be on drugs, the better drugs we have and the better they feel when they're on drugs. I think it's an important thing for society to do is to kind of work on getting good ones, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. One of the things that people who do clinical work realize is if the patient agrees with the doctor's recommendation,
Exactly.
the patient's competent. If the patient doesn't agree with the doctor's recommendation, well, then there's a really serious question about the patient's competence. Any honest clinician will tell you that's the way things are. So how do you think that should affect our ability to force people to take drugs?
No, I think that's an interesting point. But I would say that if someone is, wait, I forgot what I was going to say. So say the question again.
Yeah, the question is, how should the fact that people tend to think when the patient agrees with the doctor, the patient's competent, but if they don't agree,
because even if they're not competent when they agree, the overwhelming likelihood is someone else is going to say, take the medication. So why go through the trauma and the time and the process and so on to do something where the outcome can be done without that? So I do think I think, theoretically it doesn't make sense. If you're competent, you're competent. Or if you're incompetent, you're incompetent. But in terms of practicalities, I don't think that's a bad policy.
Are you suggesting that when there's disagreement, virtually always the person will be overridden?
That tends to be the case.
Yeah, well, that's right, and that's my question.
Yeah.
Is that wise?
Yeah, well, some people say, what's the use of a right to refuse medication if virtually everybody's decision is going to be overridden. But I actually say it's not that clear because it may be that a lot of doctors, knowing what the standard is, aren't bringing their patients to court because they know they're going to lose. So that with the standard, you are giving more people a right.
One of the things that you talked about, and Elyn has written so compellingly about the overuse of mechanical constraints and seclusion in the United States, which is not used in the UK. And it's not because the UK population is somehow different from us, it seems to me. There's obviously something social going on. We agree entirely. Force is vastly overused in our system. I was wondering how you feel about the increasingly common practice of outpatient involuntary commitment. That is, where the person is not forced to go into a hospital against their will, but must go for outpatient community treatment, and they only will be hospitalized if they don't show up. Now, how well that's enforced is another question, but I'm talking about in principle.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting concept. I think by and large it's a good thing. On the one hand, though, you're coercing more people than you would have. On the other hand, you're keeping more people out of the hospital, so it has benefits and costs on both sides. What I like to do, I like this kind of one free shot idea where you know, people say, well, mental health patients, you know, after they get treatment, thank you. Well, I think the studies show about 50% say thank you.
Yeah.
But, you know, so maybe the idea of like trying involuntary treatment if the person isn't, you know, committed to it, and then seeing whether they do thank us. And if they do, they can write an advance directive saying, if this happens again and I don't meet the commitment standard, I still want to be treated, or, you know, that kind of thing. So, and the same with outpatient commitment, you know, try it once and see what happens. And,
Yeah. I mean, the data on outpatient commitment, for those who don't know it, is there aren't very many good studies of the efficacy of outpatient commitment,
Right,
but
right.
everything depends on dose and intensity. In other words, if you keep people in outpatient
Right.
commitment for a significant period of time with significantly intense treatment, then it seems to succeed. And that leads to my next question, which is, what are we going to do about the insufficiency of community mental health care?
it's a terrible problem, and it's
It
one
is
of
a
the
terrible
things
problem.
that Dr. Feldman has written about. So what are we going to do about, say it again?
Insufficient community treatment, because what we
I mean,
know...
it's a scandal. It's a scandal,
right?
It's a scandal. LA County Jail and Cook County Prison in Chicago, and maybe one other place, or the big Rikers Island. They're the biggest psychiatric facilities in the country. It should not be that way. Jail and prison are not good places for people with mental illness.
Yeah.
So I had a student. I don't usually remember my students' last names. Her name was Petra, and one day she said to me, instead of writing a term paper, can I do a documentary? It's LA, right? So I thought, yeah, she'll use a handheld video camera. That would be totally fine. Well, she called about a month later. Professor Saks, I got a really good cameraman, and I'm negotiating with a director. And I thought, she must have industry connections. Marlon Brando was her father. But she made a 70-minute documentary about people on Skid Row and LA and that kind of thing. It was really amazing. And she had one guy who she's interviewing saying, you know, I get picked up for, you know, crimes like, you know, trespassing or, you know, indecent, you know, not indecent exposure, but disturbing the peace and things like that. And they bring me to jail, and then they say to me, you know, get online. And my voices say, go over there. So I go over there, and they beat me up, and they mark me up as having an infraction. So when you have two people with the same charge or the same, you know, conviction and the same sentence, if you have a mental illness, you're likely to stay considerably longer than if you don't.
Yeah.
And that's not good. It's not a good place for mentally ill people to be.
Yeah, the actual level of provision of mental health services in jails is dreadful. In probably half the jails in the United States, there's no mental health treatment whatsoever. There's no treatment for
Wow.
substance abuse, even though
Yeah.
it is very common. This leads to my next question, and you raised the data. Places like Rikers and the LA County Jail are huge repositories for people with severe mental disorder, which is true, by the way, disproportionate to the rates in the population. And so a lot of people say, well, what we've done is we've simply moved our incarceration from state hospitals to jails. And many people call for a reinstitution of more involuntary inpatient hospitalization. Would you be in favor of that? No, it's a hard,
It's a
maybe
really hard
unfair question.
It's really a hard question. I think, before I would endorse something like that, I would endorse trying less restrictive things, like outpatient commitment, or like just really encouraging people to seek treatment. Sometimes I talk about, should we be studying ways that we can use force more, or should we study ways where we don't need to use it as much? And I'm talking with some folks at UCLA to do a study, and have 3 groups. One group will be people who get on medication and immediately take to it and say, I'm never getting it off it. The other end are people who either don't get on it or keep trying to get off of it. And in the middle are people who start out in that latter group not wanting it, but what I call tip to wanting medication. And if we can figure out why they tip, perhaps we could encourage other people to tip faster, and that would be a good thing.
One of the MacArthur Project on mental health and law discovered that if you treat mental patients with dignity and respect, and you explain to them what is being done, even if you are in fact coercing them, they don't feel coerced, and they're much more likely to cooperate. This has also been shown in studies with citizen and police encounters and the like. If you treat people with dignity and respect, they will treat you back with the same dignity and respect.
As it turns out, though, at least in Los Angeles, I can't remember if it's a third of the cases where injury occurred or just a third of the cases where excessive force was used have mental health disorders, even though we're not close to a third of the population.
Yeah, in fact, when you look at the rates of violence associated with severe mental disorder, it's more likely that they're going to be a victim than they're going to be a perpetrator. In fact, the rates of serious violence among people with the most severe mental disorders is no higher than in the general population at large.
Yeah.
So Elyn is absolutely right. Well, I think maybe, Eric, it's time to open it up to the entire audience.
I think that would be great. There's microphones.
There are microphones, and I will just call on people and answer, and Elyn will answer the questions.
Please, anyone who has a
Unless you
question
know
or
better.
comment, step up.
Sir. I'll just go up there so I can see people.
Thank you for that inspiring talk. I actually had a question that connects a bit with the UK and the experiments by R.D. Laing, who was very anti any sort of medication for patients psychotic or schizophrenia, because I think his fundamental belief was that schizophrenia and some of these things were a pathway to a different reality, maybe a higher reality, and our existing drugs and treatment. Of course, part of the reason why the UK went negative on forced treatment and forced confinement was in large part because of Lang's philosophy then. And it was quite successful what he ran out of that little building that he did, where he had all the patients but never gave them allopathic drugs at least, but they were free to use other substances. Some of them were psychedelics and LSD and other things. So I'm just wondering what your reaction to that is. His entire philosophy that the medications were sort of dumbing them down and bringing them back to a logical structured world, but this was taking them to another reality, which...
It's an interesting question, and in fact, when I volunteered at the chronic psych hospital in Oxford, one of my patients had been a patient of R.D. Laing, and would describe running through the woods naked, and it was just very non-traditional for what I knew about mental health care. But he liked him, and he liked his time there. Is it a higher reality? I mean, I think there are all sorts of philosophical issues around mental illness, and how do you distinguish it from eccentricity or difference, and can it actually be a higher level kind of being? All sorts of philosophical questions, and I say I understand it as a biochemical illness that needs medication and intensive therapy because that's what makes my life better, and if someone else has a view that it would be better to hallucinate a lot, they'll have access to things that other people don't have. Totally their decision. I don't think it's a higher reality, but I know some people do.
Sir.
Dr. Saks, thank you for your lecture and your inspiring book. I couldn't put it down once I started reading it. I'm Mitch Feldman. I'm Chief of General Medicine at University of California, San Francisco, and better known as Eric's brother. In this context, I have I think maybe two questions. One piece of your book that really got me in my gut was reading about the physical restraints.
Yeah.
And from your experience in England contrasted with your experience in the US. And as an internal medicine, particularly trainee, I wrote and signed a lot of orders for physical restraints on patients, thinking that I was preventing them from harming themselves and doing good. And I read that passage from your book with a lot of regret that I had been involved with that. And I'm curious about the legal issues around that and why are we still permitting that to go on in the hospitals here? What are the legal precedents around that? I had another question also, if I can just throw it out there at the same time, which is, having come from San Francisco with just a terrible epidemic of homelessness there, the other place where patients are going, in addition to the prisons, are out on the streets. And we give them the right to choose to go live on the street if they're able to say they're not going to harm themselves or others, and can tell you that where they can find their next meal, even though it may be out of a garbage can. And that doesn't feel like appropriate treatment. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about housing as a part of the key pieces of treatment for patients with serious mental illness.
Great questions, thank you. Yeah, I have a really bad memory, so if I repeat myself, put your hand up and go like that. But anyway, mechanical restraints. I wrote my law school note on mechanical restraints. I went actually to one of my professors who was a psychiatrist at the law school and told him I was writing this and that it must be very degrading and painful. And he said, "Oh, Elyn, you don't understand. These people are different from you and me. They're psychotic and they don't experience restraints the way we would." And I did not have the courage in that moment to say, "No, we're not different. It's a really horrible experience." When I wrote my law review note on restraints, there were doctors, and I don't know how many are still around, who thought restraints were a form of treatment and that patients felt safe in restraints and that they liked them. I've never met a patient who's been in restraints who ever expressed that opinion. And then they also say, well, even if they don't feel safer, they are safer, they keep people from hurting themselves or others. Actually, there's a lot of evidence that people in restraints are harmed a lot. 1 to 3 deaths a week, which was the figure quoted in a series of articles in the Hartford Courant, die in restraints. They aspirate, they vomit, they have heart attacks, they strangle. Given that we can staff special someone, or if someone's dangerous to others, put them in a seclusion room, query, are we really saving people's lives or causing their death? So it's not an easy question. And I have thoughts about what an ideal restraint regime would look like. I don't know if we want to go into that level of detail.
Why don't you take a minute?
Take a minute, okay. So first of all, I would say we should only use mechanical restraints when we absolutely need to. An example would be transporting someone in an ambulance to a hospital. You don't want someone to go up to the front and strangle the driver. That's a really awful way to say it. To disrupt things that might affect driving. Or if someone needs to be at close quarters with a nurse or a doctor or an attendant, you may need to do that to protect other people. But otherwise, I don't think we should use restraints. The second thing, I think, is we should really procedurally burden the use of restraints. So we should say, you have to check every 15 minutes, that's pretty standard. But I would also suggest that every hour, you actually have to go in the room, take the person out of restraints and see how they do. And then every 3 hours, do something else. Because if you procedurally burden the use of restraints, they're going to be used less. And that was the experience in New York. They had a restraint law that after an hour, the doctor had to come in and let the patient out. Surprise, surprise, most people were released before that point. So procedurally burdening restraints can actually help people. And then also, I just wouldn't do 4- and 6-point restraints, tying someone's spread eagle to a bed. I've had the good fortune to never having been abused myself, but a lot of patients with psychiatric histories do also have an abuse history. And tying someone's spread eagle to a bed, I would think would be quite triggering and traumatic. I used to have nightmares about being restrained. It was really, I also used to have a fantasy that somehow I was able to lock all the doctors and nurses in the seclusion room, restrain them all, open the door and let all the patients leave. You know? The way we cope with these things. The homeless question is a really interesting question. I have a good friend who used to be at a county mental health clinic. Now she has half-time private practice, and half-time she goes to people at, you know, Santa Monica Beach and connects them with services. I think there's an interesting question about homeless mental illness and whether that should count as grave disability. One theory is if you're living on the streets, then you aren't able to provide essential food, clothing, and shelter for yourself. Another theory is if you provide food, clothing, and shelter to the same degree that other homeless people do it, then you're not gravely disabled. I think a case could be made for the first, and that if you are mentally ill, there's a possibility that we will be able to treat you, get you well, and get you off the streets, whereas you don't have that with someone who doesn't have a health challenge. But I think it's an interesting and important question, and it's another scandal. You know, the jails and prisons, that's a scandal. Homelessness is a scandal. We even have it, you know, at USC, a very wealthy school. We have kids who sleep in the library, in the stacks of the library, because they can't afford housing, and we should do better. It used to be the case that we would get people off alcohol and drugs, get them in medical treatment, get them in psychiatric treatment, and then give them housing. The new kind of theory is housing first. If you don't have housing, everything else is so much more difficult, so let's get people housed, and then we'll work on medication and physical health and things like that.
Question here, yes.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Professor Saks. Steve Jaffe, the Division of Medical Ethics here, and also a pediatrician. You, in talking about requiring that people take medication against their will, you drew a distinction between people with and without competence, realizing that it's not always so clear to tell who is which. I'm curious your thoughts on the notion of a psychiatric advance directive where somebody who are clearly competent says, if and when I find myself in a position of incompetence, do not medicate me.
I think psychiatric advance directives are a great thing. I mean, I would have two reservations. One is they're not like used very much, even in regular medicine. So I remember I was having an intake interview. I was going to have some kind of procedure, physical health procedure, and the intake person asked if I had an advance directive, and I said yes. And she didn't ask where it was or what was in it or anything like that. There was nothing about it. I just said yes. And then the second thing is, you know, changing your mind. So I tell a story. I was in college and it was exam period, and I kept going to my friend's room and asking for cookies. And one day I said to her, look, you know, please don't offer me cookies. I'm gaining weight. I shouldn't keep eating them. And if I say I changed my mind, I really want them, say no. And if I said I really changed my mind, still say no. So the next night I went upstairs and I said, you didn't invite me to have cookies. And she said, well, you told me not to. I said, well, I changed my mind. She said, you told me it doesn't matter, but I really changed my mind. I just got up and I walked a mile and got myself cookies. You know? So it's, you know, it's sort of an interesting phenomenon. But I think advance directives are a really good idea. Also doing a study on something called supported decision making. Have I talked about that?
No.
So it's basically, instead of finding someone incompetent and appointing a guardian to make their decision, you say to people, pick one or two people in your life who you trust, who know you, who care about you, and have them help you make decisions. And what we're studying, we're at USC, UCLA, UCSD, and downstate SUNY right now. We're talking about Miami and Texas, and we have 2 sites in Spain. We're going to study who people pick and why. We're going to study their satisfaction with the decision-making process and downstream effects like less hospitalization, more independent living, more independent working. And our hope is that this is really effective. Most jurisdictions don't have an SDM statute, but most jurisdictions' guardianship statutes say guardianship has to be the least restrictive alternative. And our argument is SDM is less restrictive, which I think it really is. So this could, you know, if effective, when we study it, if it turns out to be effective and desired, it could kind of change the way we deliver healthcare. And I think that could be really cool. What it basically does is it restores more people to kind of being the architects of their own lives, which I think is a good thing.
Thank you, Professor, for being so open about your illness. It is inspiring.
Thank you.
I was wondering how, after being diagnosed, you managed over the years to rebuild the relationship with like kind of the outside world with other people.
Right.
Because one thing I've found with mental illness is that once you get diagnosed, like your entire life becomes about that, and kind of becomes difficult to relate to anybody on both sides. I was wondering how you handle that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So as people know, schizophrenia has positive symptoms like delusions and hallucinations and disorganized speech, and negative symptoms like apathy and withdrawal, inability to work, and inability to have relationships. A lot of the burden societally and for individuals of schizophrenia resides in the negative symptoms. And we have decent meds for the positive symptoms, but not for the negative symptoms. How did I manage to avoid those? Well, I think my first 2 years I kind of had negative symptoms. But I really think it was the therapy that kept me connected to people and connected to the world. I had lunch with a student, a couple of years ago who said basically, Professor Saks, I don't understand. I have the same diagnosis as you, but I can't seem to make friends, and you seem to have a lot of friends. How do you do that? And basically what I said was, I don't really know, but it seems to me that if you try to be a friend to other people, they'll be a friend back. It's sort of vacuous advice, but it's sort of true as well. And I'm really glad that I had that going forward, because it just made my life so much better to have rich and full and caring relationships. And I really feel bad for people who aren't able to do that. And again, I think a lot of it had to do with the therapy.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Ken Weiss from the Department of Psychiatry. You mentioned jails being the largest providers of mental health services in cities. And in my work, and I see a lot of criminals as a forensic psychiatrist, they're the same people that we're seeing in the hospitals, the jails, the emergency rooms. They just revolve around and shuffle around from one to the other. So police, it seems to me, have a lot of power in their discretion to make on-the-spot determinations separating, mad from bad.
Right.
And they don't really do a good job. A lot of them don't care. A lot of them are quite arbitrary indeed. And this is very troubling, because I see people who languish in jails simply because they did the same sort of thing, like running away from an officer, that someone else did, and they were taken to a crisis center. So my question is, in your policy work, your discussions, any way to move the discussion along in educating police or in dealing with that kind of authority in helping persons with mental illness?
That's a great point and a great idea. I think police do have a lot of power. I think a lot of police don't understand. We're making efforts in LA to, educate police. So they've spoken to me. They speak to other people. They have, as far as I understand, 2 weeks of, 8 hours a day on mental health and mental health responses. What else? And they have a hard time distinguishing mad versus bad. And I think that we need to encourage police to understand and to do the right thing. One thing I think that's happening in LA and around the country, so when we did our year at the Institute on criminalization of mental illness, one of the people who spoke was this guy named Steve Leifman, who's a judge in Miami, who set up what he calls a mental health court, which is the patients opt into it. It's their decision. They instead of being convicted and sent to jail, they're given a sentence to treatment. And if they finish their treatment successfully, a lot of times they can have their record expunged. When we talked about this at my event, one of the people there was Jackie Lacey, who's the head prosecutor in Los Angeles. You might expect the head public defender to jump on this idea, but the head prosecutor jumped on it. And she's starting a mental health court in Los Angeles. And I think that's a terrific thing to do. And one of the ways to try to, keep people out of that criminal system and into a healthcare system. But it's a really good point, and it's a really important problem.
One thing to notice about this, if I can interject, is that in the bad old days, the idea was to try to keep patients in the hospital. Now when people go to inpatient, we try to get them out as quickly as possible because hospitalization is so expensive. And so it's not clear what cops ought to do in many cases. Question over here.
Hi, Professor Saks. My name is Riley, and I'm an undergraduate student who studies psychology. And I also represent a group of students on campus who have lived experience of mental illness, advocating for other students with mental illness. And one important line of work that we do is securing accommodations for students who have mental illness. And I just want to know your thoughts on an educational institution's responsibility to accommodate students who struggle with mental illnesses.
Probably very, very good question. I'm glad there are groups on campus who are supporting each other and doing this kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, accommodations are required, right? I mean, they're not required if you're violent. They're not required if it's going to pose a severe burden. You may know more about the ADA, Steve, than I do, but they're important. And they're good. And some students say when their friends find out that they're getting that, they get angry at them and look down on them. At the law school, you know, for the LSAT, for example, we don't know who gets accommodations, and on law school exams, we don't know who gets accommodations. But I think, you know, some people with mental health disorders are as fully intelligent and hardworking as any good student without a mental illness, but can have extra challenges because of the mental illness, and trying to work with that, I think, is a good and an important thing to do. Do you all experience stigma among other students, or do they not know, or?
I think the problem that's identified most often by students who do need accommodations is the inability of, or the lack of organization on the part of the administration and faculty members that make it extremely difficult for students to communicate with their professors about the accommodations that they need, even though they've received them through the school. Not all professors are educated. They're not all knowledgeable about like school policies and the law or the rules. So that's, I think, a big problem that's identified.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Okay, so this is the finale. Make it good.
This is it. Make it good.
In your book, you talked about, at least initially, your reluctance to take medication because of your stint in rehab as a teenager. And the messaging there surrounding medication, that it means you're weak and all mind-altering substances are bad. Do you have thoughts on the messages we should be sending generally about medication?
Yeah, I was in a drug program. I was not much of a druggie, but my parents kind of overreacted. It was an after-school program. I was in it for a year or two, and they preached no drugs, not even medication. And when I became ill, that was one of the reasons I was reluctant to take medication, because I thought that would mean failure, and would it be changing who I am, and I just had real troubles with that. The one good thing about being in the program is I sort of got over all the counterculture ideas, live for the moment, achievement doesn't matter, etc., before I got to college. So when I got to college, I worked hard and did well, and that opened lots of doors. So that was a good thing, and the bad thing was like giving me a lot of negative feelings about medication. I don't really know. I have never really had a substance problem. What the norm is these days in like Alcohol Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, if they have groups and are okay with people taking psych meds, or if they preach that they shouldn't. I hope it's the former and not the latter, but I just don't know that world. So, do you have any thoughts about?
Not specifically. I was just
Okay,
wondering.
sorry,
I
putting you on
was
the
thinking
spot
more about
there.
social messaging, sort of for general consumption. I recall that you commend media and press when they bring attention to mental mental health issues. So I was wondering if you all had additional thoughts on all the issues surrounding medication and the stigmas there, and thoughts of weakness because you have to take medication and that sort of thing.
May I prevail on the group to ask one more question?
We have 2.5 minutes, so please.
We won't even
Talk
take that
fast.
long. This is a follow-up to the student, Riley, the question she asked. My name's David Ramirez. I'm the director of the Counseling Center at Swarthmore College, where I've been director for 25 years. We've had a number of students matriculate through Swarthmore College with schizophrenia and graduate and go on to lead very productive lives, as you have, Professor Saks. And I want to say that in my time, this is really a message to this group of current and future lawyers, that one of the things that the clinicians often encounter is the college counsel's obligation to manage risk management for the institution and to allow for certain kinds of practices that for which there might be arguably an unpredictable outcome. I think as you make, the case that you make in your book is that connection to society and to one's work really can make a difference if a person can be treated and continue to be part of a system. That's what we try to do whenever possible. So I wonder if you have any thoughts for the current and future generation of attorneys who might find themselves in the position of advising their institutions about an attitude in terms of approaching, allowing a student with a visible, recognizable, serious mental health problem to continue to be a student.
Yeah, I mean, one argument is someone in that position's, not going to be able to do the work and maybe affect other students, upset them, make them scared. Another side is, if there's dialogue about what mental illness is and how 25% of us have something or other, and that we can work together and that kind of thing. I think that's really, really an important message, an important practice. Actually, when I look back on when I was readmitted, I was forced to withdraw. I have no doubt that if what I went through happened today, they would not let me back in school. And I think that's too bad, and I think there are a lot of students who aren't let back in who could, and yeah, but and obviously risk management concerns are an issue, but I would hope they wouldn't dominate, what we do to help people.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, there are in the room a number of people who serve currently or have served as general counsels to the university, Penn and other universities. I think that suggests the degree to which these issues have really emerged as ones that universities, both as legal entities and as entities supporting the students, have become much more attuned to. When I asked Professor Saks earlier today when the last time was that she was in Philadelphia, I always ask that question because so frequently people say the 1980s, and then I get to brag about how much the city has improved. She said the last time she was in the city was when she was an inpatient at a psychiatric hospital
In Pennsylvania, yeah.
And so I sat here this afternoon listening to her and watching her and feeling, as we're talking about how people bounce between institutions of jails and the streets or mental hospitals, how incredibly far you have come, and how doubly pleased we are to have had you here. So thank you, Professor Morris. Thank you, Professor Saks.